She saved a Mafia boss and instantly became the next person marked for death. Jody only meant to stop one assassination. She didn't realize that one kiss would put a target on her back. The man who hired the sniper wanted Hector dead, and now he wanted Jody erased for ruining the plan. From a quiet bartender trying to stay invisible, she became the woman every enemy was watching. But they made one fatal mistake. They thought she needed protection. They had no idea she had been trained to fight back.
Today, you and I are going to examine the clinical architecture of a mafia tragedy. 5 years prior, Jody Russo buried her father, attempting to repress her criminal underworld ties. She poured drinks, adopting a ghost persona. Then, she observes Hector Ricci, the East Coast's megalomaniac mob boss, dining opposite her bar. The glint of a sniper rifle targets his cranium. Her dormant behavioral conditioning triggers instantly. 3 seconds left. She bolts across the freezing pavement, intercepts the dawn, and alters his trajectory with a kiss. We have to ask, can genuine human connection outlive the severe toxicity of a crime-family dynamic? Examine this so-called kiss of death. Jody is cleaning glasses when a sniper's glare hits the window. 5 years of repressed combat conditioning violently reactivates. The rifle barrel focuses on the establishment across the avenue, tracking Hector Ricci. Jody drops her glass. The shattering is a textbook psychological trigger. Her cortex instantly processes the lethal combat arithmetic her father programmed into her. 10 seconds until the syndicate boss is eliminated. Panic merely accelerates the timeline. She executes a desperate behavioral gamble, reckless deviation that permanently shifts the crosshairs onto her own anatomy. The trauma cycle restarts. Hector Ricci operates as the apex predator of the East Coast. Absent his control, the streets dissolve into pure gang violence. Clinically speaking, Jody's suppressed homicidal instinct simply required an external stimulus to wake up. Disturbingly calm, she instructs her coworker to manage the bar before entering the kill zone. Pushing into the February chill, her boots strike the frozen concrete. Every rapid step toward this megalomaniac reflects a psyche regressing to its darkest baseline. She infiltrates a dim environment saturated with generational wealth and illicit activity. Bypassing the host completely, her visual focus locks onto Hector. Wearing a suit exceeding her annual income, he sits surrounded by conditioned enforcers. The men are aggressively analyzing the economics of stolen territory. His enforcers verbally attack rival boss Lindsay Marone for eroding their southern burst. Instantly, Lindsay represents a secondary threat. He pauses, registering Jody's abrupt intrusion into his space. The hitmen exhibit threat-response behavior, ready to draw firearms. Yet Hector remains entirely motionless. His dark eyes scan her physical form in a slow, highly calculated assessment. Finally, he issues a dangerously controlled inquiry. "Can I help you?" 2 seconds to impact. Jody impacts the table, aggressively invading the mobster's personal boundary to whisper a verbal command. "Trust me." Then she initiates a kiss. She is literally weaponizing her own anatomy to obstruct the sniper's line of sight. Hector exhibits acute muscular rigidity. Fascinatingly, his behavioral response lacks any defensive aggression. He does not repel her. She tastes premium whiskey and total psychological collapse, mentally calculating the longest 3 seconds of her life. On the opposite roof, the contract killer Jane Vulov experiences high frustration. An unknown villain is obstructing her primary target. She curses, applying pressure to the trigger, but her employer Lindsay required 0 collateral damage. 2 agonizing seconds expire, yet Jody maintains her physical blockade. Admitting tactical defeat, Jane disassembles the weapon and retreats. Detaching, Jody hyperventilates. Hector observes her with intense pathological fascination, while his subordinates instinctively reach for their firearms. Hector elevates one hand, instantly suppressing his subordinates' aggressive responses. Exhibiting severe adrenaline tremors, Jody stammers a verbal apology. Regulating her respiration, she gestures toward the glass, revealing a sniper across the street almost terminated him. She weaponized herself as a human shield, calculating the assassin's strict avoidance of collateral casualties. Hector assesses the window, logically processing the tactical reality. When his gaze refocuses on her, it transmits a profound, chilling lack of empathy. Let us observe the power dynamic shifting in real time. The critical question emerges. How did you know? Suppressing her acute anxiety, Jody provides a single loaded variable: training heals. You can almost observe his predatory intellect dissecting that admission. She advises him to evacuate before secondary shooters materialize. Maintaining unbroken eye contact, Hector issues a directive to his enforcer. Logan, we leave now, heals. The scarred, massive man rises, a literal embodiment of blunt force trauma. Heals. Hector stands, adjusting his garments as if a lethal threat had not just occurred. Then comes the psychological anchor. He physically restrains her wrist. The grip is firm but disarmingly controlled. You are coming with me, heals. He issues this as an absolute command. This tactile connection transmits a highly irregular emotional frequency. Her survival instinct dictates immediate flight, yet his intense focus induces temporary paralysis. She attempts resistance, heals. But his micro-expressions reveal a classic cocktail of megalomaniac dominance and profound dependency. Heals. He interrogates her motive for the intervention. Internally, Jody processes the fatal reality. The rival faction will identify her as the obstruction, marking her for elimination regardless. Exhibiting learned helplessness, she yields to the escalating scenario. They exit into the alley, approaching an armored transport vehicle, a reinforced asset constructed precisely for this man's violent environment. Heals. Logan operates the vehicle while the cartel leader secures her door, a dissonant display of manners from a purely ruthless profile. The locking mechanism engages, effectively sealing her fate within his control sphere. Accelerating away, Logan monitors her with severe paranoia, demanding her identity. Hector simply evaluates her, his vocal tone perfectly regulated. Good question. We will dissect this anomaly tomorrow night. Heals. Confined inside the secure cabin, Hector interrogates her for her legal identity. Jody Russo, she exhales. Alias she buried 5 years ago. She tries to project her civilian bartender persona. Narcissist is exceptionally observant. Standard civilians do not visually acquire a sniper in under 3 seconds. Reducing the physical distance between them, his hostility masking as calm, Hector demands she abandon the psychological defense and provide factual data. Heals. Jody recognizes her defensive walls are failing. She has to confess her origins. She admits to being conditioned from birth within the criminal underworld. Her father was Anthony Russo. A heavy silence fills the transport. Heals. Logan abruptly swerves the armored vehicle, repeating the name with overt psychological awe. The primary architect of the 2018 Harbor Massacre, Jody nods. While the enforcer fails to regulate his emotional response, heals. Hector internally calculates the massive historical significance of the woman beside him. Heals. A pathological pride surfaces in her behavior. Her father methodically programmed her as a lethal asset, conditioning her in extreme violence and situational awareness. Hector's visual assessment alters entirely. She is no longer just a bystander. Heals. She is a high-value, highly dangerous anomaly. The cabin tension escalates into something far darker than traditional attraction. You share Anthony Russo's genetics, he states in a measured baritone. Jody confirms. Heals. We observe this critical data point pull Hector further into his own megalomaniacal fixation. Heals. Hector inquires about the legendary figure's location. Jody provides the factual conclusion. Deceased. Executed 5 years ago during a territorial dispute. She was 23 when she physically experienced his fatal trauma. Heals. That profound shock catalyzed her withdrawal from criminal society. She isolated herself until today when her latent conditioning reactivated to preserve a stranger. Displaying slight behavioral destabilization. Heals. Hector asks why she intervened for a syndicate boss. His sociopathic mask briefly slips. Jody turns highly conscious of the claustrophobic tension bonding them. Heals. The psychological merging in this moment is highly measurable. Jody presents her rationale. Her father ingrained the concept that an active alpha prevents systemic collapse. Heals. She analytically explains that Hector's sudden elimination would guarantee a catastrophic syndicate war. Thoroughly stimulated by her cold, sociopathic logic, Hector labels her incredible. His vocal registry suggests a dark infatuation. Heals. They remain seated in close proximity, two highly traumatized predators actively recognizing the severe psychological damage embedded in each other's profiles. Heals. So how do you and I classify this collision between two highly abnormal profiles? Jody utilizes denial to establish distance. She cites her retirement, claiming she is strictly a bartender now. But Hector deconstructs the lie instantly. Liar. Heals. He states without hesitation. Breaching her physical boundaries, he forces her to confront a clinical fact. The conditioning never degrades. The capacity for violence is permanently neurologically mapped. She resents his diagnostic accuracy, heals. Beneath her constructed civilian identity, her biochemical addiction to danger is fully active again, heals. Evading his psychological profiling, she asks for their destination. Hector analyzes her behavior, questioning her sudden concern. Jody presents the unavoidable consequence. Those operators will realize she sabotaged their contract, heals, and they will pursue retaliatory action. Hector validates this with glacial sociopathic certainty, exactly. Extending his hand, the narcissist elevates her chin, enforcing direct eye contact. It is an alarming, heals, highly controlled demonstration of absolute dominance. Jody is psychologically suffocating under the massive systemic threat she just activated by saving him, heals. Let us examine the final pathology here. Hector delivers his decree. She remains under his surveillance until every hostile threat is neutralized. Jody exhibits typical survivor denial, insisting she requires no protector, heals. But outrunning a mobilized cartel is statistically fatal. Hector displays a ruthless, highly possessive smile. She preserved the kingpin, therefore he claims ownership of her survival. A narcissistic blood oath. He grips her face, heals, eliminating the physical boundary. This is textbook trauma bonding. He intends to isolate her within his empire, systematically dismantling her civilian disguise to expose the damaged killer underneath, heals. Experiencing acute tachycardia, she finally concedes, whispering she will comply only until the immediate syndicate threat expires. Hector retracts his hand, an arrogant confirmation registering on his features, heals. His clinical assessment is correct. She lacks the capacity to leave his orbit. The psychological capture is complete. Jody observes the city lights dissolving into isolated, affluent darkness outside the glass, heals. The driver transports them deep into the fortified compounds of the criminal elite. She is voluntarily integrating right back into the pathology she fled, heals. Let us open this case file together. Jody exhibits classic symptoms of trauma relapse. A fabricated kiss to protect a cartel leader demonstrates severe cognitive dissonance. Upon arriving at his heavily fortified syndicate estate, her psychological defenses inevitably collapse. Subconsciously, she recognizes the criminal underworld remains her primary anchor. She is actively returning to the origin of her trauma, heals. The megalomaniacal narcissist, Hector, extends his hand to establish dominance. Raised by a pathological tactician, Jody complies. He guides her past illicit art, clinically stating his operatives are currently infiltrating her residence. He demands her keys with free sociopathic efficiency. Jody exhibits a desperate flight response, rejecting his forced shelter to maintain her fragile illusion of autonomy, heals. We observe a violent shift in the power dynamic. Hector deploys a predatory stare, neutralizing her defiance. The syndicate leader asserts absolute control through cold logic, hypothesizing that assassins currently occupy her residence, heals. To break her resistance, he invades her intimate space, utilizing a manipulative whisper. He begs for her address. Witnessing an apex predator weaponize vulnerability completely shatters her remaining emotional boundaries. Heals. She surrenders the keys immediately. Heals. She discloses the address. Brief physical contact initiates a tragic neurochemical bonding process. Hector delegates clinical commands, then fixes his hyper-vigilant gaze upon her. He escorts her to an isolated, luxurious guest chamber, acting as a warden securing a captive. Pausing at the threshold, he silently analyzes his newly acquired psychological asset. Heals. The environmental tension reaches critical mass. Hector states his proximity at the hallway's end, a calculated territorial marker. He validates her actions, labeling her exceptional before retreating. Left in isolation, heals. Jody utilizes hydrotherapy to regulate her hyper-aroused nervous system. An anonymous subordinate delivers her belongings. She seeks rest, but severe insomnia prevails. Heals. Her cognitive focus remains obsessively fixated on his physical features and that penetrating ocular evaluation. Heals. At 2 a.m, auditory deprivation triggers severe restlessness. Seeking hydration, she navigates utilizing stealth conditioning ingrained by her father. We observe a critical lapse in situational awareness here. Heals. She wears minimal garments, stripping herself of psychological armor. Falsely assuming security within the hostile compound, she enters the sterile kitchen under harsh artificial illumination. She opens the refrigeration unit, heals, her physical vulnerability exposed and dangerously unmonitored. Heals. A temperature drop triggers an involuntary physiological response, highlighting her lack of protective layers. An auditory stimulus pierces the dark, questioning her insomnia. The low frequency induces a psychosomatic chest ache. Jody exhibits a severe startle response. The narcissist occupies the threshold, torso entirely exposed. His heavily scarred musculature serves as a haunting psychological map of extreme interpersonal violence. Feels. Hector employs a protracted visual assessment, signaling predatory hunger. Jody experiences acute vasodilation under his ocular pressure. Establishing eye contact, he displays suppressed arousal. She issues an unwarranted apology. Feels. Adopting a defensive posture to conceal her frailty. Her verbal cognitive functions fail entirely. The sociopath initiates a stalking pattern. He falsely offers shared territorial ownership. Feels. His voice strained by the immense psychological effort required to maintain direct eye contact. Feels. He halts within her intimate perimeter. Exhibiting a rare fracture in his strict behavioral regulation, he touches his hair. His gaze drifts downward before violently self-correcting. He critiques her garment's dimensions. Feels. Displaying nervous submission, Jody bites her lip, engulfed by his physical dominance. She attempts a deflective humor mechanism, rationalizing her sleepwear choices through severe vocal tremors. Feels. The cartel leader projects an aura of absolute psychological consumption. Feels. Let us examine this mechanism together. The tragedy is her emergent Stockholm syndrome. She actively desires his dangerous proximity. Hector breaches her personal boundary. He declares himself her audience, abandoning all polite facades. He blames her clothes for his failing restraint. Jody exhales a vulnerable sigh, which he monitors with predatory acuity. Any rational subject would initiate immediate evaluates. Before this dark pathologies swallows them entirely. Feels. Paralysis sets in. Motor functions cease. She experiences a compulsive urge to seek secondary exposure to his destructive kiss. She vocalizes his name, a signal hovering between refusal and consent. The narcissist advances. He applies light tactile stimulation to her jaw, a manipulative gentleness opposing his sociopathic stare. Elevating her chin, he weaponizes their shared trauma, using deep vocal resonance to recall her desperate public intervention. Feels. He notes her presence in his territory, draped in inadequate textiles. His digits map her cervical spine, registering as severe neurological burning. He issues a clinical inquiry regarding her motives. Feels. Warning she approaches his psychological limits. She categorizes the encounter as accidental, but autonomic microexpressions reveal the deception. Her physiological arousal contradicts her verbal denial. Feels. The antagonist monitors her accelerated heart rate via thumb pressure on her carotid artery, systematically inducing severe somatic tremors. Feels. He categorizes the variables as hazardous anomalies. Exercising extreme executive function, he withdraws. This sudden absence of proximity triggers acute withdrawal symptoms. Feels. Jody actively suppresses the urge to re-enter his gravitational pull. Hector mandates immediate isolation, citing his rapidly diminishing impulse control. Tachycardia sets in. She offers a fragmented dismissal. Feels. Experiencing vocal dissociation as she attempts a rapid retreat. Her flight response abruptly halts upon hearing his dark, amused vocalization. Feels. He dictates her future wardrobe choices with immense psychological weight. Experiencing maladaptive euphoria, she escapes, clutching her water as a symbolic barrier. Ascending the stairs, Feels. She detects his compromised emotional regulation as the sociopath verbalizes his own vulnerability. Securing her perimeter, Jody exhibits severe hyperventilation. Despite prior commitments to avoid high-risk individuals, Feels, she stands trembling inside a syndicate stronghold, exhibiting acute symptoms of trauma-bonded romantic starvation. Feels. Deep sleep is unattainable following the severe neurological spike downstairs. Hector projected a contradictory duality, the desire to systematically dismantle her psyche while simultaneously shielding it. Feels. Exhibiting temperature dysregulation, Jody conceals herself, actively suppressing a pathological urge to breach his territory for mutual destruction. A digital stimulus interrupts. Her primary support system demands data. Feels. Recognizing the impossibility of articulating this psychological distortion, she transmits a pacifying fabrication and terminates the device. Feels. The auditory void acts as an environmental stressor. She obsesses over his contradictory behavioral markers. Extreme lethality paired with anomalous tactile gentleness. Physiological depletion finally induces an unconscious state. Feels. Manifesting subconscious fantasies of their contact. So what do you and I conclude from this? The survival mechanism has completely inverted. She engages not for self-preservation, but out of severe psychological starvation. Heals. We are observing trauma mutate into pure clinical obsession. Heals. Diurnal rhythms force a return to conscious vulnerability. The true clinical tragedy lies elsewhere. The Kingpin's primary threat vector is not his syndicate leadership, but his capacity to induce severe self-destructive ideation. She suppresses all internal warning systems. Confronting her reflection, she observes pupillary dilation and extreme capillary vasodilation. You and I understand this physiological arousal is entirely disconnected from the environmental temperature. Feels. She verbalizes recognition of her peril, yet her reflection indicates total pathological surrender. The subject experiences identity dissolution, actively deriving pleasure from this psychological submersion. Feels. Reality forcefully invades her cognitive framing. The traumatic bonding sequence solidifies. The fabricated intimacy, the vehicular extraction, and the intense nocturnal confrontation. Feels. Mere cognitive rehearsal of these stimuli triggers a dangerous flood of neurochemical heat. Feels. She employs hydrotherapy, using thick clothing as a physical barrier against further psychological dismantling. Downstairs, she encounters Logan. An ocular assessment of his flat effect confirms active violence. She issues a regulated greeting. Logan embodies a contrasting psychopathology. Devoid of Hector's executive functioning, he operates as a dysregulated entity, displaying overt sociopathic violence as pure ego reinforcement. Feels. Let us examine this clinical file together. Logan points to the coffee. Jody grips her mug, grounding technique after severe trauma. Hector enters. His suit acts as psychological armor, masking the predator beneath. They lock eyes. The silence is a textbook dominance test. Hector breaks it, reverting instantly to his detached syndicate persona. Jody recoils, displaying an acute flight response. She wishes she could disappear. Feels. Hector demands the intelligence report, his tone flat and effectless. Logan outlines the reality. Jane Vulov was the shooter, contracted by Lindsay Morone. That name acts as a severe psychological trigger. You can observe aggression physically radiating from Hector. When Jody looks, the man she bonded with has dissociated. Only the sociopathic Kingpin remains. Hector whispers the rival name. That quiet fixation indicates a highly lethal, predatory intent. Feels. Hector sips his coffee, displaying repressed rage while demanding coordinate. Logan promises aggressive intelligence extract, but then he introduces a frustrating variable. The assassin exhibits perfect evasion tactics. She vanished entirely. Logan shifts his clinical gaze to Jody, altering the room dynamics. The impending psychological trauma of this realization is palpable. Feels. Logan outlines the cycle of violence. If Morone funded one hit, another is guaranteed. The target is Jody. Hector exhibits a severe protective reaction. He bypasses typical narcissistic injury, showing primal fear for her survival. Nobody touches her. He dictates with absolute authority. Logan observes his superior carefully, then introduces the inevitable psychological inquiry. Feels. Logan probes the underlying tension. Is the Kingpin developing an emotional attachment? The silence is clinical. Jody fixates on her coffee, exhibiting avoidance behavior. Finally, he categorizes her as an ensemble positive, intelligent, resilient. He acknowledges her physical appeal. Jody experiences acute physiological shock. She looks up, finding his gaze locked onto hers, projecting a terrifying level of obsessive hyperfixation. Feels. Logan recognizes the emotional transference. He notes her genetic history as Anthony Russo's daughter, a prominent underworld figure. Hector acknowledges the hierarchy, maintaining his fixation on Jody. He then issues a clinical directive: protect her as his personal property. This disturbing display of territorial possession dominates the room, inducing a severe state of cognitive dissonance within her. Feels. Logan boldly asks if she is already classified as his asset. Hector responds with sociopathic certainty, projecting an inevitable outcome. Not yet. He directs a predatory gaze at Jody, guaranteeing future compliance. Logan departs. Total isolation is established. The silence resumes, saturated with an extreme psychological friction that feels entirely claustrophobic. Feels. Hector breaches her proximal safety zone, his micro-expressions demanding submission. Jody uses humor as a defense mechanism against her elevated pulse, noting her confinement. Hector dictates they will dine together. It mimics a suggestion but functions as a strict mandate. This demonstrates authoritarian control, yet she shows zero inclination to escape. Feels. He designates a secluded terrace for their interaction. The morning induces a dissociative state. Jody isolates herself in the library, experiencing severe cognitive spiraling over his possessive declarations. By noon, she adopts compliant behavior, acknowledging the futility of resistance against a megalomaniac. She enters the terrace. The curated environment overlooks a garden, functioning as a carefully constructed psychological sanctuary from his inherent violence. Heals. Hector waits. Removing his formal armor paradoxically increases his perceived threat level. He manages her seating, the physical contact triggering a neurological spike. Staff serve the meal and retreat. The consumption phase is non-verbal. Jody struggles with her inhibition. Hector initiates. Establishing intense eye contact, he successfully draws her into his manipulative psychological sphere. Yields. The antisocial exterior recedes. Hector employs calculated vulnerability, inquiring about her father. Jody details a textbook psychological paradox. He was a lethal enforcer, yet a nurturing caregiver. Yields. He conditioned his child with firearms training, followed by positive reinforcement, preparing her for environmental hazards. She discloses her core trauma event. Her father expired from massive hemorrhage in her presence over territory. Yields. His terminal action was a desperate directive to evade this criminal life. Yields. Hector actively processes her traumatic disclosure. He mirrors her grief, acknowledging the generational burden, and validates her caregiver. Then he presents his own developmental trauma. Inheriting massive debt post-bereavement, Yields. He was placed in a highly hostile environment. He constructed his enterprise through systematic emotional detachment, deliberately eroding his empathy. Instantly, Jody makes a clinical observation. They possess identical trauma pathologies, Yields, functioning as a shared psychological reflection. Yields. A secure baseline is established. Hector then introduces a critical stressor, asking for desire reintegration. His vulnerability is genuine, making their trauma bond undeniable. Jody exhibits zero ambivalence, issuing a definitive negative. This represents years of established avoidance behavior. She escaped that high-risk environment and strictly rejects any regression. Yields. She cites her primary trauma trigger as the reason for withdrawal. Let us examine the clinical tragedy here. Her past is his active reality. Hector proposes a hypothetical guarantee of security. Jody logically deconstructs this cognitive distortion. The real threat is chronic hypervigilance, systemic violence, and anticipated grief. Hector submits to this truth, concluding the standoff. Yields. Jody assumes he accepts the rejection. Instead, Hector leans in, dismantling her defensive barriers. He reframes the scenario, focusing on their interpersonal connection. The baseline destabilizes. Jody repeats his words, exhibiting tremors. Hector confesses an emotional attachment. This disclosure from a ruthless figure leaves her completely stunned. Feels. He correlates his attachment to her life-saving intervention. Her emotional defenses experience critical failure. She confirms mutual attraction, balanced by severe anxiety. Hector exhibits genuine psychological pain. Heals. Interpreting her fear as a personal rejection, she clarifies the pathology. The stimulus of her phobia is not him, his criminogenic environment. Her clinical fear is that prolonged exposure to his syndicate will induce personality changes. Heals. Ultimately transforming her into the sociopathic archetype she actively avoids. Heals. Hector initiates tactile contact, demonstrating a gentle affect contrary to his antisocial profile. He proposes gradual desensitization. He guarantees compartmentalization of his violent activities, Heals, while openly displaying his psychological dependency. She observes the physical connection, processing his emotional dysregulation. From a clinical perspective, she has reached a critical threshold, Heals. This bond will either function as extreme therapeutic rehabilitation or result in total psychological annihilation, the ultimate symptom of her Stockholm Syndrome. She is fully prepared to surrender to the pathology. Heals. She verbalizes compliance, agreeing to the gradual pace. Hector exhibits an authentic positive affect. He kisses her hand, finalizing the psychological contract. Temporarily, Heals. She experiences the delusion that their conflicting realities can integrate. A 7-day incubation period follows. They establish an abnormal but stable baseline. She uses escapism while he manages illicit operations. Heals. Their evenings operate as intensive dual therapy, rapidly accelerating their trauma bond. Yet, despite being insulated by extreme resources and hypervigilant security measures, Heals. The subject experiences acute claustrophobia. She displays a severe deficit in normal socialization. Furthermore, her primary external contact, Jamie, exhibits escalating panic regarding her survival status. On Thursday, she overrides her avoidance instincts. Locating Hector processing intelligence, she bypasses her hesitation and issues a direct demand to exit the perimeter. We understand the catastrophic anxiety a megalomaniac experiences the moment his primary emotional attachment attempts to leave his controlled environment. Hector breaks focus. His acute cognitive dissonance manifests physically. His pathology dictates he isolate her for asset protection, yet his newly formed empathy recognizes the toxicity of confinement. Modulating his vocal affect, he interrogates her destination. She uses coffee preparation to mask her stress, explaining she must neutralize Jamie's panic before law enforcement is triggered. Exiting the compound is a massive probabilistic error. Syndicate rivals operate continuously, waiting in the peripheral environment to exploit any exposed psychological vulnerabilities. With security, Hector barks. It is not a request. For a megalomaniac, control is oxygen. Jody submits, already bracing for the psychological weight of his dominance. Hector deploys Marcus, his top enforcer, a former military operative built for mass casualties. Hector demands she stay in his sight every second. Jody complies, accepting the grim irony of needing a hitman to visit her old workplace. When this massive enforcer enters the kitchen, his eyes instantly sweep the room. He is a human weapon, clinically processing fatal threats. You and I need to examine this silent drive to the local bar. Jody was conditioned by her mobster father to panic during quiet moments, a classic hypervigilance response. Marcus drives with chilling precision, calculating every single escape route. Stepping outside, he shadows her, physically primed to snap a neck. Jody desperately fakes normalcy while this killer hovers. Inside the bar, Jamie is washing glasses, wearing the same traumatized stare Jody had after the sniper attack. Seeing Jody, Jamie's mask shatters into shock, rage, and desperate relief. Jody, finally. I thought you'd. Jamie freezes the second Marcus blocks the doorway. Her terrified eyes beg for privacy. Hey, Jamie, Jody replies. She forces her voice to stay flat while her bodyguard stands there like stone. Sorry I vanished. Look, I can explain. She never finishes that thought. In 1 microsecond, her brain processes a sound, a suppressed pop from the street. Jody's repressed childhood trauma instantly fires back up. She recognizes the exact acoustic signature of a silencer. Panic floods her system. Marcus drops dead before his hand even touches his gun. A dark pool of blood quickly spreads across the clean floor tiles. Jamie starts screaming, but Jody is already experiencing auditory exclusion. Her focus locks onto the woman entering the room. This intruder, well, she moves like a predator. Her eyes are completely vacant, viewing Jody as just another name on a hit list. This assassin is a textbook psychopath, hollowed out by violence. Jody Russo, Jane says. Her voice is clinically detached, like she is reading the morning news instead of committing murder. Lindsay sends his regards. Jane reaches for her gun, but Jody's fight-or-flight system is already activated. Her father physically battered survival tactics into her brain, so she would never freeze when death walked through the door. Jody throws the closest table straight at the threat. Jane barely flinches, but it gives Jody enough time to close the distance. She grabs Jane's wrist before the gun clears the holster. What follows is a brutal display of conditioned violence. 2 deeply traumatized women trading lethal strikes. Jody tastes blood from an elbow to the mouth, but she absorbs the shock, fighting for control of the weapon. Jane is a terrifying fighter, but Jody survived a violent childhood by taking beatings from massive cartel men. She learned the physics of leverage to survive. When Jane throws a wild punch, Jody ducks under it, traps the arm, and weaponizes the killer's own momentum against her. Let's pause and observe this shift. You and I are watching childhood trauma completely take the wheel. A sickening crack of bone breaks the silence. Jane screams, collapsing as her arm snaps into a twisted angle. Jody calmly picks up the dropped weapon, aiming it at the killer's head. Her hands are steady despite the massive adrenaline dump. Who sent you? Jody asks. She knows a gut, but forcing confession is a control tactic. Lindsay. Jane chokes out a broken laugh. High on pain, the assassin shows a disturbing sociopathic amusement. Yeah, she gasps, clutching her ruined arm. He wants you dead for saving Hector. Tell him he needs to try harder, Jody replies. Her voice is completely flat, hollowed out by years of conditioning. Her mob boss father would be proud. This is the exact emotional void he trained her to use. Oh, feels. He will, Jane whispers. The killer's eyes show a dark respect, recognizing a fellow survivor of severe trauma. Next time, you won't be so lucky. I am always ready, Jody says. She slams the heavy steel grip into Jane's temple. Feels. It is a calculated strike to cause unconsciousness, never death. Jane came to execute, but Jody refuses the role of murderer. Psychologically, this restraint is the only boundary keeping her from becoming the exact monster she was raised by. Feels. Jane drops to the floorboards, fully unconscious. Jody lowers the gun, finally allowing the adrenaline crash to make her hands shake. She looks at Jamie, hiding behind the counter in a state of pure psychological terror. Suddenly, feels. Tires scream outside. Jody's posture instantly locks up, expecting another wave of violence. Then her brain processes Hector's armored vehicle. The door flies open before the car even stops. The crime boss steps out, feels. His usual narcissistic mask completely gone. His frantic eyes scan the bloody scene until he finds her. Seeing Jody alive triggers a raw, desperate relief across his face. And for Jody, feels. Witnessing that vulnerability creates a profound emotional ache, the undeniable root of their trauma bond. Feels. Hector walks in, his brain coldly processing the carnage. His enforcer is dead, the assassin is broken, and Jody stands alone in the wreckage, bleeding but dominant. You took her down? Hector asks. His voice holds genuine awe, mixed with a dark, feels, territorial pride. Sickeningly, this predatory validation actually makes Jody flush. Yeah, she breathes, finally letting her heavy psychological defenses drop. Her captor-turned-protector is here. She was skilled, but I am better, feels. My father taught me well. A deeply conflicted pride hits her. She spent 5 years trying to unlearn her father's violent psychology. But tonight, that toxic conditioning kept her alive. She can no longer deny her brutal legacy, feels. Hector closes the gap, frantically scanning her body for injuries. As his fingers trace her jaw to check her split lip, a tragic warmth fills Jody's chest. You are bleeding, he murmurs. Feels. His voice reveals far more emotional dependency than a cartel boss should ever show. I am okay, Jody whispers, holding his hand. I have survived worse. Right then, Logan walks in with a cleanup crew. They silently erase the murder scene, feels, proving how sickeningly normal this violence is for them. So what are you and I left to conclude here? Jody is finally realizing that this trauma bond is permanent. Loving a narcissist means locking herself in the dark forever, feels. Hector turns her around, hands are heavy on her shoulders, gentle, but asserting absolute dominance. Lindsay won't stop, Jody warns, trying to ground him in reality. He wants us both buried. Hector shows zero fear. Then I put him in the dirt, he replies clinically. He looks at Logan. Find Lindsay now. Give me a location. Feels. Already tracking him, Logan says, running the hunt from his tablet. Jody observes this cold criminal machinery. She is fully relapsed into her old life. Hector pulls her fiercely against him, marking his territory. She feels his racing heart, a rare crack in his sociopathic armor. You stay with me, he breathes into her hair. Always, no arguing. Her rational brain screams to resist, to prove she doesn't need a dangerous savior. Feels. But psychologically, she is exhausted. Letting a violent kingpin become her shield feels like a dark relief. All right, Jody surrenders against him. Instantly, his rigid posture relaxes. Jamie walks over, deeply traumatized, feels, looking at Jody with a sickening understanding. Just go, Jamie whispers. Stay safe. Hector keeps a possessive hand on Jody, leading her out. Safely locked inside his armored car, Jody collapses against him. Feels. She finally lets the raw neurological shock take over, fully submitting to the syndrome. Feels. Let us open this psychological file together, shall we? Jody just survived an assassin and surrendered her agency to a cartel kingpin. It feels like trauma-induced psychosis, though her bruised ribs are clinically real. You did incredible, feels. Hector whispered, kissing her head. A calculated display of tenderness from an apex predator. Riding through the night, fully aware Hector intended to erase Lindsay completely, Jody exhibited classic trauma bonding. She dared to hope, feels. Yet clinical dread remained. Does the Stockholm Syndrome ever end well? Or is this merely the eye of the storm? Chapter 5. The Lindsay Confrontation and Total Narcissistic Possession. Feels. Observe this behavioral regression with me. I am not leaving, Hector whispered, vanishing before dawn. Jody woke to the deadbolt engaging, his heavy boots fading. Acute anxiety took hold. Today, the systematic hunt for Lindsay Marone began. Feels. She rushed to the glass, observing 4 armored vehicles exit the compound. The brutal Mafia ecosystem she actively fled was now her primary habitat. Morning brought severe depressive symptoms. She paced the floor, heels, catastrophizing about his violent death on the concrete. Then Logan delivered 3 clinical words over the phone. "We found him." Heels. That auditory trigger induced a severe panic response. The mere thought of his absence shattered her emotional baseline. In exactly 7 days, this megalomaniacal narcissist had systematically rewired her attachment style. Heels. At a decaying port facility, the physiological threshold of violence broke. Hector deployed 10 tactical enforcers, catching Lindsay's faction entirely unprepared. Gunfire ruptured the auditory silence like structural collapse. Heels. 10 minutes of profound brutality later, the physiological peak occurred. 4 hostile subjects neutralized, 3 hemorrhaging, 1 in active flight. The aging rival was clinically cornered. Heels. Lindsay Marone was a veteran underworld figure operating on severe cognitive bias. Yet as Hector advanced, firearm drawn, acute neurological panic flooded the older man's system. They forced Lindsay onto the abrasive concrete. Heels. Hector loomed above him, exhibiting the flat affect of a true sociopath. "Why did you try to clip me?" he asked. That low-decibel vocalization transmitted far more psychological terror than shouting. Lindsay expelled blood from his mouth. Heels. Maintaining eye contact in a desperate display of shattered dominance. Heels. Lindsay hypothesized that Hector possessed an unsustainable monopoly on local violence. He required the apex predator eliminated. Pure transactional logic. Hector processed this slowly, validating the rationale. Heels. Then he interrogated the singular variable of interest. Why target Jody? The hemorrhaging subject actually laughed, expelling arterial fluid. "Because she saved your life," he sneered. "I saw the footage. She is your only weakness." Heels. "Killing her would break you." The unmasked, terrifying micro-expression of absolute hostility that contorted Hector's features forced even his most desensitized lieutenant to physically retreat. Heels. When Hector finally vocalized, the ambient tension paralyzed the space. "You were wrong," he murmured, adjusting his ballistic trajectory downward. "She is not my weakness. She is my strength." The firearm discharged. Heels. Lindsay shrieked as the projectile destroyed his femoral tissue, triggering massive blood loss. Hector depressed the weapon, displaying total emotional detachment. "You never touch what is mine." Understood? Experiencing severe hypovolemic shock. Heels. Lindsay indicated compliance. "Understood," he choked out. Hector exhibited a micro-smile of predatory satisfaction. "Leave my city forever." "Because the next round," Heels, "goes right through your skull." He applied the heated barrel to the subject's frontal lobe, then withdrew. The physically shattered rival crawled outward, painting the concrete crimson. Heels. Hector analyzed the retreat with absolute psychopathic neutrality. By evening, his transport breached the perimeter walls. Indoors, Jody exhibited severe psychomotor agitation, suffocating in generalized anxiety. Heels. The acoustic signature of his vehicle triggered a massive dopamine release. She sprinted to the entryway as he entered. Visual contact established. He was intact. The biological evidence on his clothing belonged to a foreign body. Heels. The somatic burden of survival instantly evaporated. "Is the war over?" she whispered. Hector engaged the deadbolt. "It is done. Lindsay is gone." The phrasing carried the psychological weight of his organizational dominance. Heels. Then her defense mechanisms triggered. "So can I go back to my normal life now?" she asked. The instant the verbalization occurred, her trauma bond rejected the concept. Separation suddenly induced acute distress. Hector physically stalled. Heels. "You really want to leave?" he asked. The apex sociopath suddenly displayed genuine vulnerability, rendering the subject entirely nonverbal. Heels. "You and I must analyze this pivotal interaction." Clinically speaking, Jody experienced profound dread regarding her isolated apartment. "No," she admitted, vocal cords trembling. "But I thought you kept me here for protection." Heels. Hector eliminated the physical boundary, forcing a dramatic cardiovascular spike. He initiated intense, unregulated contact. "I want you here because I want you," he stated. "Not for safety, just you." Heels. The megalomaniacal narcissist extended his hand, stroking her face with deeply unsettling gentleness. "Stay with me," he whispered, his tonality acting as an auditory sedative. "Not as a guest, as mine." Heels. The declaration hung suspended, a psychological annexation. Heels. Rational cognition demanded flight, but her emotional dependency surrendered entirely. "I will stay," she breathed, "but no syndicate operations. I am only here for you." "That is all I need," Hector murmured. Heels. Eliminating the remaining physical distance. This physical connection was not an evasion tactic. It was unfiltered, obsessive psychological merging, a total collision of pathological attachment. As their lips connected, feels, her amygdala deactivated completely. He secured her waist, grounding her as intense limerence consumed their rational faculties. Feels. She secured her arms around his neck, physically clinging to a highly lethal organism. A paradoxical display of terrified self and absolute compliance. Separating for oxygenation, Hector maintained close proximity. Mine, he rasped. Feels. Initiating a significantly more profound oral fixation. Pausing once more, he positioned his frontal lobe against hers in the dim lighting. Mine, Jody whispered back, fully capitulating to the textbook Stockholm Syndrome. Feels. That statistically rare, unfeigned expression of joy on his features acted to completely dismantle her remaining ego defenses. Feels. Inside that entryway, the subject fully rationalized her romantic attachment to a clinical psychopath. 90 silent days elapsed in the file. We observe Jody returning to consciousness on a temperate May morning, enveloped in linens. Feels. In close proximity, Hector exhibited deep sleep, temporarily divorced from the severe hypervigilance intrinsic to underworld leadership. She remained stationary, conducting a visual analysis of his resting features, feels, before quietly extracting herself from the mattress, preserving the predator's dormant state. Feels. Their behavioral patterns stabilized into an atypical baseline, entirely divorced from the severe trauma that bonded them. So how do you and I evaluate this equilibrium? Feels. She cohabitated with the kingpin while fiercely protecting her psychological autonomy. He strictly compartmentalized his homicidal operations away from their environment, an inherently unstable social construct, yet functionally viable. Feels. Jody even resumed dispensing alcohol at her previous workplace. Predictably, Hector saturated the perimeter with covert surveillance personnel. She adopted a compliant facade, actively ignoring the highly dangerous Feels. Silent operatives consuming beverages in her peripheral vision. Feels. Jamie exhibited mild contempt toward the security detail, recognizing the systemic cost of attaching to a sociopathic entity. Eventually, they developed situational blindness to the armed personnel. That morning, Jody navigated to the kitchen, Feels, discovering Hector in a conscious state. Processing the visual data of an organized crime leader in casual athletic wear dispensing caffeine induced profound cognitive dissonance. Feels. The simulated domesticity of a hyper-violent male triggered deep empathetic distress within her. Detecting her presence, he produced that exclusive fragmented micro-expression. Good morning, his low-frequency vocalization vibrated. Feels. Bypassing her neurological shields. He initiated physical contact, projecting olfactory notes of hygiene products and gunpowder. Feels. As analysts, we understand such environmental stability is statistically improbable. She vocalized softly against his sternum, extracting a momentary hit of oxytocin before external stimuli interfered. He transferred the coffee to her hands. Feels. A rudimentary display of pair bonding. Later, Jody re-entered the primary compound. She had systematically disrupted the sterile architecture, introducing sentimental photography and literature. That evening, Jamie arrived for an assessment. Feels. Intensely curious about her peers' psychological endurance within this high-net-worth captivity scenario. Feels. Ambient light decreased. Hector had authorized the external civilian contact, his use of sarcasm indicating his profound antisocial barriers were deteriorating. At twilight, Jamie's heavily oxidized vehicle breached the perimeter. Feels. A striking economic disparity against Hector's exotic motor pool. Jody escorted her through the primary residence. The visitor exhibited acute psychological distress. Feels. Oscillating between grandiosity and intense phobia regarding the illicit capital funding the structure. Reaching the exterior decking with wine, Jamie established a fixed visual lock on Jody. You are glowing, she diagnosed quietly. Feels. Her vocal tone registered positive emotion, camouflaging severe apprehension regarding the subject's moral decay. Jody consumed her beverage, suppressing positive affect. The chilling clinical reality was, Feels, her autonomic nervous system had never registered such vitality. Feels. Her serotonin levels had reached a multi-year peak. I am happy, she articulated, bypassing conscious filtering because the data was empirically accurate. She hypothesized to Jamie that Hector possessed a dual nature. Feels. The lethal syndicate operator actively deactivated his defensive mechanisms in private spaces, demonstrating consistent, non-threatening proximity. Jamie processed this with visible cognitive lag. Feels. before administering a necessary behavioral intervention. Even though he is a literal mafia boss, she offered zero moral condemnation, merely profound skepticism that Jody was actively courting the exact trauma she escaped half a decade prior. He keeps me out of the dark, Jody rationalized, displaying textbook dependency. It was factually correct, The apex predator controlling the local ecosystem finally regulated her respiration, She maintained her employment in the service sector, deliberately segregating her identity from his violent enterprise. He exhibited deep attachment devoid of typical narcissistic coercion. Then Jamie administered the critical diagnostic query, So you love him? The interrogation bypassed Jody's cognitive defenses, inducing temporary respiratory arrest. She experienced paralysis. Vocalizing the diagnosis would immediately collapse the dissociative state into objective reality. So much, she confessed. The decibel level was negligible, yet the psychological gravity was absolute. It was clinically irrefutable. Her ego boundary was entirely subsumed by Hector Ricci. She had formed an intense traumatic bond with the way this megalomaniac visually prioritized her over the rest of the ruined population. She attached to the dormant guardian underneath his psychopathic exterior, a highly dangerous organism that surprisingly honored her physical limitations. Jamie manufactured a gentle micro-expression and initiated hand-holding, functioning as a grounding mechanism unique to long-term peer relationships. They occupied the space without auditory exchange, the evening devolving into unforced social bonding. During departure, Jamie initiated deep pressure therapy through a hug, whispering, "Be happy, you deserve it." The emotional resonance of that validation penetrated her defenses, instantly triggering an involuntary physiological tear response. You and I must examine this behavioral pivot very closely. The subsequent morning, Jody dispensed alcohol, entirely blind to the high-stakes intelligence exchange occurring off-site. Within his soundproofed operational base, Hector ensured isolation with his biological sibling Logan. Logan was auditing illegal revenue streams when Hector vocalized, his baseline frequency disturbingly flat. "I am going to ask her to marry me." Logan physically released the documents, experiencing a total processing failure. He quantified the attachment as severe but a legal binding. Seriously? Logan managed to articulate acute neurological shock restricting his airway. "Boss, this is massive." A rare affect registered in Logan, observing a violent man conceptualizing a reality outside their brutal paradigm. Hector's response retained his usual sociopathic focus. "She is my absolute fixation," he declared. "I am enforcing permanence." Logan clinically assessed the core flaw. Would the subject actually consent? Both understood she had spent 5 years exhibiting intense avoidance behavior toward Hector's criminal syndicate. Hector's response displayed an uncharacteristic vulnerability, yet his obsessive persistence rapidly resurfaced. "I will pursue her daily until compliance is achieved," he stated. Logan exhibited an atypical, unguarded laugh, briefly masking his inherent hostility. "You are psychologically compromised by this female," Logan observed. Hector conceded immediately. The apex predator presented a serene affect, interpreting total psychological surrender to his fixation as his ultimate behavioral triumph. They sat silently, Logan initiated physical reassurance, validating his pathological entitlement. "She will consent," he affirmed. Later, Jody discovered Hector exhibiting high anxiety pacing, reminiscent of a confined predator. He immediately initiated a restrictive embrace. Fascinatingly, the subject experienced a flood of positive reinforcement. Jody's severe flight response had collapsed entirely, finding paradoxical shelter within the city's apex threat. She remained completely oblivious to the impending shift. Constricted against his chest, her hypervigilance dissolved. He verbalized his emotional attachment. Her respiratory rate spiked, highly reactive to his frequency. "I love you too," she echoed, surrendering to this manufactured safety. Projecting into an unwritten timeline, she accepted the cognitive distortion. Her evasion tactics had permanently ceased. 6 months of systemic conditioning passed. A functional behavioral loop had formed. She maintained an illusion of autonomy at her workplace before returning to his controlled estate. However, a severe anomaly occurred on Friday. Hector entered her environment, breaking his established pattern. His dark attire and blank affect radiated predatory tension. "Let us examine this data together." You and I recognize this acute physiological stress response when a subject's baseline irrevocably fractures, heals. Jamie exhibited nonverbal awareness as the subject approached. Jody displayed dismissive body language, masking a neurological spike of panic. Are we stable? She inquired, knowing a kingpin's daytime visit usually indicates violence. Heals. Everything is optimal, Hector responded, utilizing a manipulative micro-expression. I require your early extraction to view a location. This phrasing bypassed traditional authoritarian commands, heals. It functioned as an inescapable psychological pull from a master manipulator, heals. Define the parameters, she requested, discarding her work garments. Jamie gestured her away, entirely complicit. She initiated following behavior. An undisclosed variable, Hector labeled it, extending his hand with calculated charm, heals. She accepted the physical contact. Exiting the structure, she observed his vehicle lacked any standard security detail. For a high-threat narcissist, abandoning defensive countermeasures indicated a massive psychological gamble, feels, deliberately exposing his core vulnerability, feels. The transit lasted 60 minutes, transitioning from urban stimuli to coastal isolation. Hector maintained rigid, silent motor control. Jody actively analyzed his nonverbal cues, attempting cognitive empathy, feels. Their trajectory terminated at an elevated geological formation bordering the dark ocean. Atmospheric conditions presented a bruised twilight spectrum. Why this specific coordinate, she verbalized softly, feels. The sheer drop evoked primal insignificance. Frigid, saline wind impacted them, while violent aquatic kinetics pounded the rocks below. The environmental variables were perfectly calibrated for a permanent psychological anchor, feels. I want you to analyze this setup with me. Hector, a subject conditioned by extreme violence, initiates dual tactile contact. He establishes intense eye contact, inducing targeted sensory deprivation, feels. He discloses this geographic selection stems from her previously stated fantasy regarding aquatic tranquility. Jody exhibits temporary cognitive paralysis. Her memory retrieval fails to locate the data point, feels. Hector observes her with severe pathological fixation, precisely citing the verbalization occurred 90 days prior, feels. He archived a minor conversational point about coastal matrimony, claiming he catalogs her latent desires. Jody's cardiovascular activity accelerates as cognitive dissonance shatters, feels. The syndicate leader views her as his psychological tether. With deliberate respiratory pacing, he confesses she preserved his existence. She utilized intimate contact as a tactical diversion against a shooter. Increasing his grip, feels. He admits this induced a craving for an existence outside his sociopathic hierarchy, feels. He desires a familial unit, an outcome statistically improbable for a violent offender. Jody's vision blurs as psychological gravity triggers respiratory distress. The dominant narcissist then adopts a physically submissive, kneeling posture. Backlit by the sunset, Jody experiences acute cardiac arrhythmia. She vocalizes his name as emotional regulation fails entirely. Hector displays a nurturing expression, extracting a velvet container to reveal a flawless diamond, feels. The mineral refraction mimics the sunset. Hector forces direct eye contact, submitting his matrimonial request. His tone projects a stark psychological fragility concealed from his subordinates. He demands immediate legal binding, feels, isolating the event. Jody exhibits physical tremors, vocalizing a constricted whisper. Did his memory retention actually function? The cartel leader guarantees flawless auditory recall. His voice fractures as he pleads for cohabitation, feels, offering her complete psychological dominance over his life, feels. He proposes a shared authoritarian dynamic. Jody projects her affirmative response at maximum decibels. She pulls her partner upward, initiating a high-impact bodily collision. The syndicate head emits genuine laughter, feels, applying restrictive pressure and spinning her. His fine motor skills deteriorate visibly as he secures the jewelry onto her digit. He executes an intense physical exchange, fusing their codependent neuroses. Disengaging, feels, they mimic neurotypical happiness. Jody experiences facial fatigue from the severe endorphin release, feels. Consider the clinical precision here. Jody clears her vision, her processing finally aligning with his input. Immediate matrums, directing her visual field backward. Her fixation was so absolute she failed to sit an elderly male beside Hector's primary executioner. Statistically improbable, Logan displays a positive facial anomaly. Hector explains his logistical foresight. He procured an efficient, utilizing his hitman as the legal observer, feels. Hector proposes delaying the ritual to orchestrate a syndicate gathering, but Jody issues an immediate negative response. Her vocal rejection triggers synchronized amusement in both aggressive males. She demands instant gratification, feels, isolating the event from criminal traditions and the scrutiny of hostile actors. Her psychological needs condense to aquatic acoustics, her primary attachment figure, and a secondary social bond, feels. Hector's facial musculature reflects unguarded euphoria, temporarily overriding his dark triad traits. He confirms immediate execution, intertwining their digits, feels. The civilian efficient advances while Logan activates his device for visual documentation. Jody maintains visual lock on Hector, retroactively rationalizing their severe trauma exposure as a necessary catalyst for this homeostasis, feels. This marks a permanent behavioral pivot. Advancing 30 minutes, they occupy the precipice. The dissociation resembles a fugue state. Hector applies high-pressure physical containment, feels, his possessive grip indicating lingering paranoia that the criminal ecosystem might forcibly reabsorb his psychological asset, feels. The efficient displays a lacrimal response. Logan records with an affect inconsistent with a professional sociopath. Friction on the gravel disrupts the silence. Jody initiates a startle response, demonstrating cognitive confusion, feels. Her cardiac rhythm stutters when her platonic bond, Jamie, exits a degraded vehicle in shock. Jody visually interrogates Hector. The apex predator offers a dismissive gesture, feels. He masterfully manipulated the logistical chessboard purely to deliver this highly controlled dopamine spike, feels. Hector asks if she believed he would exclude her primary support. This calculated empathy collapses Jody's emotional regulation. Jamie accelerates, initiating a high-intensity embrace. They maintain mutual containment, feels, exhibiting distress and joy signals. Jamie hypothesizes this chaotic anomaly is the optimal ritual for Jody's profile. The clinical assessment is accurate. Traditional structures cannot rival this absolute fixation, feels. The efficient produces an auditory cue. The observers take position as the pair orients toward the ocean to begin their bonded phase, feels. The sky presents a saturated spectrum. The efficient verbalizes fidelity, but Jody's auditory processing is bypassed, her focus lost. The contract phase begins. Hector applies tactile pressure, his voice piercing the wind. He reveals she preserved his life via an unexpected kiss. Jamie and Logan exchange shocked expressions, finally identifying the acute, high-stress catalyst that initiated this trauma bond. Feels. This represents a total paradigm shift. He details the incident where she bypassed self-preservation to shield him. He pledges her security against his illicit ecosystem. Despite acknowledging her resilience, he commits to synchronized survival, feels. The sociopathic leader visibly hesitates, suppressing an acute emotional response. At a low murmur, he elevates her status to his equivalent. She is not an acquired asset. She is an autonomous apex figure, feels, and he pledges an indefinite behavioral loop to permanently earn her choice, feels. Let's open the case file. Jody exhibited zero resistance to her physiological response. Taking a ragged breath, she spoke. "You gave me a new life," she whispered, seeking tactile grounding. She rationalized her attachment to an apex predator, feels. "When I spent 5 years just surviving, you showed up. You proved I could have a partnership where I didn't lose myself. No darkness, just love." Hearing her friend sob reinforced her trauma bond. "I promise to love every version of you," she declared, feels. "The gentleman and the dangerous one, the kind heart and the ruthless boss," feels. "Let's examine this pathology together. I promise to challenge you and support you always. To make you happy because you brought me joy I never knew existed. Always." The efficient smiled, words carrying over the wind, feels. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." Hector exhibited typical predatory ownership. He pulled Jody in, kissing her with a dominance that bypassed her motor control. Her reality simply vanished. This cartel kingpin was now her legal spouse, feels. They maintained contact until the sun hit the water, soaking the beach in gold. Pulling back, they exhibited hysterical laughter. Witnesses cheered. Hector leaned in, resting his forehead, feels, against hers. They maintained this contact for a full 60 seconds, synchronizing their respiratory rates, establishing a new baseline. "My wife," he whispered, vocalizing his absolute possession, feels. The smile fracturing his typically sociopathic features was alarmingly genuine, triggering a somatic response in her chest. "My husband," she replied. The neurological conditioning was complete. Their accomplices initiated physical contact, feels, pulling them into a group embrace. They stood on the sand, fully repressing the Mafia threat. A brief, chemically induced euphoria. Just humans clinging to one another, celebrating a psychological safety that contradicted their violent reality. Feels. Fast forward 2 weeks. She stood under the Greek sun on a private island funded by illicit capital. It presented as a manufactured utopia, turquoise water, white sand, and an isolated environment completely controlled by him. Feels. The only variables were staff acting as unseen facilitators. They spent their days engaged in shared physical activities, cementing their trauma-bonded isolation, existing entirely off the grid. No syndicate violence, no cartel paranoia. Feels. A complete psychological disconnect. On their 10th night, she stood alone by the shoreline, observing the sunset bleed across the fading horizon. Feels. Her toes anchored in the sand, seeking stability. Hector emerged from his natural habitat, the shadows, and physically restricted her movement, wrapping his arms around her. "This is perfect," she breathed, experiencing a severe delusion of safety. Feels. "Thank you for giving me what I needed before I knew it. You deserve the world," the narcissist whispered, applying positive reinforcement to her neck. They stood in that manufactured tranquility. Then he spoke. Feels. The sudden drop in vocal frequency triggered her nervous system, yanking her back to reality. Feels. "You and I need to observe this specific trigger. Notice the atmospheric shift." "I have a question for you," Hector murmured, projecting an emotional weight designed to capture her focus. She turned, pressing her hands to his chest. Feels. Monitoring his autonomic responses. He deployed a rare display of vulnerability, effectively neutralizing her threat detection systems. "Do you want children someday?" The inquiry hung in the air, a classic mechanism for generational control. Feels. Her chest constricted under the psychological pressure, a monumental life pivot. Yet her conditioned response fired immediately. Zero cognitive delay. Feels. "Yes," Jody answered instantly. We can observe a massive release of tension in his facial musculature. "I want them with you." She paused, testing his emotional investment. "And you?" "Very much," he replied, projecting absolute certainty. Yet, Feels. He masterfully avoided applying direct pressure. "Only when you are ready." This is classic behavioral manipulation from a cartel boss, creating the illusion of autonomy. He offers her the choice while masking his obsessive desire. Feels. Viewing this violent man who accepted her psychological damage without forcing rehabilitation, Jody experienced an adrenaline spike. It compelled her to reveal a hidden variable. Feels. "What if I told you I am ready?" she asked. His pupillary response was immediate. Not this exact second, but soon. The resulting smile fractured his carefully constructed psychopathic facade. Feels. It temporarily dismantled decades of conditioned hypermasculinity, exposing a rare raw neurochemistry. He initiated physical contact, a kiss serving as a nonverbal contract for reproduction. "Then we start trying," he murmured. "Whenever you want." Feels. "Soon," she repeated, experiencing an oxytocin surge in her chest. "I cannot wait," Hector whispered. He kissed her again as the solar cycle ended, surrendering the environment to his native darkness. Feels. Standing on that isolated beach, she fully internalized the delusion. They had manifested a secure attachment, actively denying the syndicate's reality. Jump ahead 1 year. Feels. 365 days since Hector fractured her psychological baseline at that cliff edge, they were returning. But today, her elevated heart rate had a biological origin. Hector drove, displaying a narcissistic smirk. Feels. Falsely believing he controlled the narrative. Obviously, Jody anticipated the location. Parking at the site of their initial trauma bond, the environmental triggers fired. They stepped onto the exact dirt of their vows. Feels. Hector initiated a full-body embrace, a manufactured shelter forged through mutual survival. Feels. 1 whole year, she murmured against his sternum, monitoring his resting heart rate. "Honestly, it feels like you proposed yesterday." "Best year of my life," Hector replied, pressing his lips to her cranium. They occupied a tense silence. Then, Feels. He created physical distance, a recognizable dopamine spike visible in his eyes. "And this next year? It is going to be even better." "Oh yeah? Why is that?" she baited him. She already possessed the classified data. Hector traced her facial structure. Feels. His lethal hands demonstrating a controlled gentleness that interrupted her respiratory cycle. Feels. His vocal tone betrayed an optimism strictly forbidden in organized crime. "Because maybe we start our family." He scanned her micro-expressions for validation. "You said you were ready." Her cardiovascular system accelerated. Feels. Lacrimal fluid built in her eyes as the stimulus was presented. She grabbed his scarred hand, forcing it against her abdomen. It was anatomically flat, but psychologically carried the weight of a genetic legacy. "Hector," she whispered, "feels. What if I told you we already started?" His respiratory system stalled. Catatonic rigidity set in. We can pinpoint the exact millisecond his prefrontal cortex processed the data. What? He breathed. A fractured acoustic signature. "Feels. You and I need to pause the tape right here." He stood entirely devoid of his sociopathic defenses, desperate for biochemical validation. "I am pregnant," she cried, tears breaching the surface. 8 weeks. I needed to tell you here. Feels. Right where it all started. She secured his hand to her biological core, where our real life began. Hector emitted a guttural noise, a severe neurological short circuit between joy and trauma. Decades of Mafia conditioning disintegrated instantly. Feels. Celine pooled in the kingpin's eyes, tracking down his face. The subsequent gaze lacked any predatory intent. "Really?" His vocal cords constricted. Feels. "We are going to be parents," she affirmed, exhibiting stress-induced laughter. "Yes. You are going to be a dad." That phrase was his cognitive breaking point. His executive function collapsed. The apex predator dropped to his knees in the dirt. Feels. Surrendering his vertical advantage, his traumatized hands exhibited severe tremors as he anchored to her waist with an obsessive fixation. "Hi, little one," Hector whispered, vocal cords vibrating with unregulated affect. "I am your dad, Feels, and I already love you." He pressed his lips to her garment. Looking up, his pupils dilated with perceived redemption. "Thank you for saving me," he confessed. Feels. Jody descended into the dirt beside him, abandoning hygienic protocols to pull him into a grounding compression hold. She embedded her face in his shoulder, silently validating him for acknowledging her damaged psyche. Feels. And for constructing a reality she deemed statistically impossible. His nonverbal response registered as an absolute behavioral contract. They simply remained in the dust, two deeply traumatized subjects clinging to one another. Feels. Discharging emotional fluid as the solar radiation illuminated the atmosphere. Separating, they utilized laughter to cope with the severe wreckage of their histories. Feels. It was that hyper-intense serotonin flood triggered only when chronic hypervigilance finally ceases. Feels. Hector manually wiped the moisture from her face, then his own, before questioning the genetic variable, boy or girl. Jody placed her hand over his. It was premature, she noted, but she felt an intuitive certainty, a female. Feels. Hector's facial muscles contracted into a display of unfiltered pride. He projected the offspring would be an aggressive survivor, mimicking the mother's pathology. Pulling back, Feels. Jody hypothesized the infant would inherit his sociopathic obstinance. Hector expelled a genuine, resonant laugh. He pulled her close, maneuvering them to the precipice, dangling over the violent, rhythmic ocean below. Feels. Positioned shoulder to shoulder, they maintained a physical anchor. Hector's hand migrated back to her abdomen, tactilely claiming his biological continuation. They engaged in synchronized breathing as the sun bled across the horizon. Feels. Jody observed him, requiring explicit verbal validation. Was his dopamine response authentic? Hector hesitating. He analyzed his subject and stated she had rewired his entire existence. Feels. The ultimate form of psychological rewiring. He brushed her stomach softly. The syndicate bloodline would persist, but theoretically sanitized. Naturally, he experienced simultaneous terror and severe euphoria. Jody leaned against him. Feels. Confirming her emotional baseline had finally synchronized with his. Feels. The subject admits the chronic void in her chest is finally gone. Since her father died, her baseline for security was completely shattered. Yet Hector offered an extreme, reckless form of attachment, a surrogate family she never anticipated. Feels. They sit in this shared reality as the sky bruises purple, the first stars bleeding through. Clinically, what happens next is fascinating. Hector leans toward her abdomen, his voice dropping to a whisper. Feels. He feeds the unborn child a mythologized version of their mother. He frames her as the savior of a doomed man, his singular psychological tether to survival. Feels. Hector presses a kiss to her dress, swearing a blood vow to isolate this child from his syndicate's violence. Jody weeps, offering the maternal validation he craves, whispering he will be an excellent father. He simply pulls her closer. So, Feels, what do you and I conclude from this psychological case file? Up on that exact cliff where their trauma bond initiated, Jody realizes she outlived her darkest depressive episode. That frantic kiss in a dive bar operated as a mutual life raft. Feels. Pulling them from the wreckage and establishing an unbreakable, codependent bloodline. Feels. To her, every physical and psychological wound was simply the cost of entry to his dark world. Let us unpack the lingering pathology here. Notice how the cliffside anchors three critical escalations. The proposal, the ceremony, the child, heals. It becomes their shared geographical obsession. Consider Hector's hypervigilance. He memorized a fleeting months-old daydream Jody had about an oceanfront wedding. This hardened sociopath treated her casual remarks as absolute gospel. Heals. And the ceremony? Executed a mere 30 minutes after her compliance. A manic, desperate sprint to secure attachment. Note the timeline. Anthony Russo died when Jody was 23. Heals. She carried that complicated grief for 5 solid years before this pathological romance ignited. Heals. 5 long years pouring drinks, masking severe trauma in plain sight, until Hector entirely reconditioned her reality. Now consider the collateral damage. Jane Volkoff, incapacitated in that tavern, simply fades into the background, heals, permanently erased from their psychological board. Then there is Marcus, the only subject to suffer a fatal outcome in this violent sequence. Lindsay escaped with a fractured femur, heals, proving even a severe antisocial personality retains a sliver of restraint. Jim bore the massive psychological weight of Jody's origin from day one. And Logan? Heals. He nearly crashed his vehicle when the reality of Jody's genetic legacy finally registered. Frankly, the most rational human reaction in this entire narrative. Want to analyze another tragic mafia romance? Click the next video, Heals, and review the next case file with me.